Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you particularly to Tendai and to Taylor for extending this invitation, and to everybody for finding a free Friday afternoon to come and talk with us. I'm just going to say a couple of things, and then I'm going to play a really old piece of work, and then I'm going to talk about two things which actually relate to the exhibition, my contribution to the exhibition Women on Aeroplanes, which I don't offer just as a straightforward plug, because I don't think that's what it is, but I think that hopefully they might help those comments might help to illuminate some of my questions or positions around the issues of representation and praxis, particularly as in relation to Rabz's opening. I would have to call it a keynote. Just a little bit to say where I speak from. I have a highly academic background, a highly expensive academic background. I come from literature, I think, primarily, and from theatre, and from one of my, looking back now, because it's getting to that point in my artistic career where I can look back and go, oh Jesus, you can look back now. I can see that for a very long time I've been interested in how we know what we know, where our ideas come from, particularly about people and places that are distant from us, be they geographically distant or culturally distant, and where we get our values and ideas from, and how certain kinds of values become authoritative, normative, and legitimated. So this has been something that I can look back now and see has been obsessing me in various forms for many years, which means that I have an abiding interest in historiography, in the processes but whereby history is written and transmitted. And I'm very interested also in the role of the arts in these processes. So that's something which seems to stick with me in some way, shape or form in every project that I work on. I'm now going to show a more or less self-explanatory video that I made between 2003 and 2005, which is technically before I started to name myself as an artist or my work as art. So then the next thing I just wanted to throw out there is some research I did actually in the course of my own master's thesis a million years ago, which I wrote on revisionist war memorials. So in the early 2000s, in the lead up to the 60th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, a number of new Second World War memorials went up in London. And I suppose this was still, we were all, I think, culturally still a bit drunk on the whole kind of end of Thatcherism and New Labour. And I remember that very famous Patsy Kensit and Liam Gallagher cover of, was it, I can't remember, Vanity Fair, but Cool Britannia. And there did seem to me, in this very kind of unresearched way, this attempt at kind of national rebranding. And I think that some of these memorial projects were part of this project of national rebranding. The two that I'm going to mention, which are within walking distance of the ICA, we mostly don't notice them, are the Women at War Memorial, which is on Whitehall, and the Commonwealth Memorial Gates, which are actually at the end of the mall, just as it reaches Hyde Park Corner. And I just, public art, I think, is a huge part of how public histories are produced and disseminated. But it's also, they're very easily ignored, and it's only usually when someone defaces one of these bits of statuary, that anything happens. And incidentally, in the course of my research, I discovered that actually the penalties for doing that are really severe. People do go to jail, like properly go to jail for defacing public statuary in the City of London. Now, the Women at War Memorial was, first of all, campaigned for by a group of women who had been in the Wrens, I think attached to a regiment in Yorkshire, and they decided that it was time there was a memorial for women. Incidentally, the first memorials commemorating women's active service in the West started going up in about the 1970s, so Britain was a bit slow. They found a man who was working on the regiment to work with them to try and raise the money, and they then enlisted the services of Dame Betty Boothroyd, who became the patron of the campaign. They found a sculptor who, and there was a big, it's a very technical process we don't need to go into now, as to very bureaucratic as to how these things get done. But they found a sculptor who proposed the idea of a statue of a female air raid warden saving children during the Blitz. And on the pylon below it would going to be it's okay. My attention span is very poor. So, and below, and on the pylon below this woman saving children, this abstract, unnamed, metaphorical woman, were going to be coat hooks, and on each of these hooks were going to be the uniforms that represented the jobs that women did in the service of the nation during the Second World War. And initially, this statue was going to go up in front of the Ministry of Defence on Whitehall, where there are, if you have ever noticed, there are enormous statues of the Second World War generals, all in their battle fatigues. And at the end of this was going to be the female air raid warden and the pylon underneath. When they began excavating to build the memorial, they discovered a huge gas main that it was going to cost £300,000 to divert. So in the end, they said why they went back to the City of Westminster and to the government and said, could we possibly put it in the middle of Whitehall, near the cenotaph, which is Edward Lutyens' cenotaph that was built first of all out of plaster in 1920, and then became a public memorial. Was rebuilt in stone in 1921. And the response was, yes, but you have to get rid of the statue of the air raid warden. So you can have the pylon, but you can't have the woman in active service. And the committee who organised Memorial agreed. And so if you walk down Whitehall or ever notice it, it's in dark bronze. The cenotaph is white as stone, so it's very visible. You will see a pylon which is full of coat hooks of different uniforms. And a wise friend of mine called Andrew Walsh pointed out to me around this time that that public monuments commemorate people at specific historical moments. So if you take this literally, what the Women of War Memorial represents in terms now today in London is not women's active service, but the moment after they gave up their active service and returned to the domestic sphere. So that's the Women at War Memorial. The other one is the Commonwealth Memorial Gates, which are 4, again, pylons up just before you get to Hyde Park Corner, and a kind of pergola. I've lost the architectural the detailed vocabulary for it. And in the pergola, on the roof, you have the names of particular Commonwealth soldiers who died on active service, or who I think were awarded medals for bravery. And then there's a small plaque next to it which explains what the memorial is. But on these four pylons, these 4 sort of large stone, pylons, pillars, which were approved by Prince Charles, by the way, because they're so close to Buckingham Palace. He had design approval over the memorial. It says Nepal, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Africa, Caribbean. And it says it on all 4 of them. So if you drive past, that's what you see. And I tracked down the woman who had organized these memorial. Her name is Baroness Flather. She's a Conservative MP from, I think, Maidstone, somewhere in Berkshire. And I asked her, I said, first of all, I have a couple of questions about this memorial. And she said, I said, well, first of all, Nepal was technically never a British colony. So why is it on the Commonwealth memorial gates? And she said, well, if you remember at that time, there was that court case with the Gurkhas, and they were taking the Ministry of Defence for court because they were not being given equal rights to the British soldiers with whom they had served. They were not being given rights of abode in the UK or access to services. And the Ministry of Defence came to me and said that it might, you know, would I possibly mind adding Nepal to the memorial because, you know, it might help a bit, you know, in terms of their cause. There is actually also now a Gurkha memorial behind the Foreign Office. And I said, okay, yes. And I said, so India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan were not in existence in 1945. So why are we doing this? And she said, well, you know, it's got so tense. It's so difficult, but, you know, with those countries now. I am paraphrasing, but there is a dictaphone tape of this somewhere in my house, which, so I'm sure I'm not doing her too much of a disservice in my account of this. And she said, so we decided it was just easier that we made it England, Bangladesh, Pakistan. And I said, so Africa, Caribbean, that's a lot of countries and colonies. And Baroness Flather said to me, well, there were so many, we were bound to forget someone. And that's why it says what it does. And it's also worth noting that that was a memorial. Memorials always have huge numbers of committees and boards and campaigns and patrons. And every single High Commissioner of every single former colony had signed off on that memorial, which I think, barring an earthquake or a bomb blast, is going to be with us forever. So anyway, I just wanted to tell those 2 stories. And then finally to talk a little bit about Amy Ashwood Garvey and Women on Aeroplanes. Women on Aeroplanes is a project that began as a result of a group of curators who had been involved in a large-scale research project that took place at the House of World Cultures in Berlin, which was called After Year Zero, which I think was in 2014, is when it had its first public outcomes. And that was a project that was trying to look after the moment of independence, beginning year 0 being the year of independence and looking at the aftermaths of colonialism. And in their reflections afterwards, they began to, some of the curators started to wonder why women featured so marginally in the narratives of independence and its aftermaths that had been explored in this exhibition. And so Women on Aeroplanes is a project that began, the invitation that was extended to me was framed as a project that was looking at how and why it is that women become erased from the narratives of anti-colonial independence movements. So and I suppose I ought to say this before, is that I'm only a very, very, very occasional filmmaker. I don't make them very often, and I make them very crudely. And this is a project that began with people who were curators of film, but I said I'd be quite interested, because I really care about sight and about caring about making work in specific relation to where I am and what's happening in the place where I am or where something is intended to be shown, I thought it would be interesting to try and think about women in London. And for those who don't know or those who do know, London is one of the most important centres for the organisation and the sustenance of anti-colonial movements. It's where people met in the city and they organised in the city, and it served a hugely important role in terms of many, many liberation struggles. And through this, I discovered Amy Ashwood Garvey, who is known mostly for being the first and the bad wife of Marcus Garvey, who co-founded with her the UNIA, the United Negro Improvement Association, and African Communities League, but who, after she left him, went on to have an extraordinary career and an extraordinary involvement and participation in a number of struggles to do with civil rights, to do with Pan-Africanism, anti-colonialism, feminism, in a number of different countries around the world. And the reason that, and I suppose it's a project that I began this year and have had to work very, very fast on at breakneck speed. So I'm still in a huge process of reflection, and I still have to quietly finish bits of the installation, which are not done yet. But one of the questions I was asking myself is how has this woman disappeared from history? What are the mechanisms and moments and instances whereby that have allowed her to fall through the gaps, that have allowed her to fail to have any kind of prominence within the official histories of feminism, of civil rights, of independence movements, for example. And there were a number of, I'm just going to mention a number of small, in the dying moments of the match, I can see I've got to stop talking in a minute, but a few of these sorts of little tiny mechanisms whereby this comes into play. One which I think might be quite useful in the context of a film festival is an experience I had at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, which is in Harlem in New York. And I went there because they had the only known video of Amy Ashwood Garvey, the only time she'd ever been recorded. And I went to look in the database, and it said interviewer unknown, date unknown. And I went up to the Schomburg, and they were very super friendly and very helpful. And I watched this video, and it was immediately clear to me that it had been shot in some kind of television studio. It clearly had TV production values. There was good lighting, there was good sound. I even saw a flash of what looked like an ABC logo at the beginning. And so I thought, how can this be completely unknown? Then when I was at the National Library of Jamaica the following week, it was a really insane month, July, I found a flyer that Amy Ashwood Garvey had produced to help her get speaking gigs while she was visiting the US in 1960s. And one of the things it says on it was, look for her on Like It Is with Gil Noble on something September 1968. So I immediately went off and said, well, who's Gil Noble? And discovered that Gil Noble and his current affairs program, Like It Is, was possibly the most important current affairs program for the African American community ever. Certainly, it seems to have been one of there seems to be no important figure that he didn't interview. There was no issue that was not covered. The program went on for, I think, 30 years. I think it only stopped when he died or shortly before he died. If you go on the ABC website, they say, please stop asking us for copies of Like It Is, because this is such an important program. So I wrote to the Schomburg and I said, hi, I think I found out where this interview has come from. I think it's from Like It Is. It's definitely Gil Noble who's interviewing her. So there's a possibility here to update the database. And I got a reply saying, thank you, we will definitely look into that. And there was a silence. Then I was looking through newspaper archives, and I found another article saying that they were going to re-show this interview. It was, again, sadly, because they only ever wanted to talk to Amy Ashwood Garvey about Marcus Garvey, to whom she was married for about 3 months. And you can tell from the interview that she's actually quite bored at this point in her life of talking about Amy Ashwood, about Marcus Garvey, so it's not a terribly interesting interview. But it does say, you know, again, the newspaper says, and it contains an exclusive interview with Mrs. Amy Ashwood Garvey. And I sent this to the Schomburg as well and said, look, see, so, you know, there she is. You can update your record. And one of the consequences of this is that a lot of people will be researching Gil Noble because he's a very, very important and well-known figure in terms of politics, television, current affairs in the US. But because the database at the Schomburg has not linked Gil Noble to Amy Ashwood Garvey, it means that she will never, ever figure on any list of people who were interviewed by Gil Noble. This discussion is never going to be, this connection is never going to be made. So there's this. And then there are other examples which are similar a little bit to the omissions, ignorances, inattentions, that I think are reflected in the stories of the Women at War Memorial and the Commonwealth Memorial Gates, which I encountered on that time. But this is where I become interested in the mechanisms whereby people do and don't end up receiving any recognition within the mainstream historical record, and also starting to try to think about other, not just about corrections to that, but if there's a kind of, or there appears to be a kind of systemic failure to incorporate or to recognize the achievements of certain kinds of figures and certain kinds of bodies, do we not need to start to also think about other modes or other forms of epistemology and other forms of history writing? And I think I'll just leave it there. So thank you very much.